Serve me well, and I will give you power above thrones. Or be Carvala's puppet fool and scream while you are ground into the dust of time. Rand shifted, glancing back through the door as if seeking a way to escape. Let the Dark One think that. Beyond the doorway was still the black of nothing, split by the shining thread that ran from his body. And out there, Baalzaman's heavier cord ran as well. So black that it stood out in the dark as if against snow. The two cords beat like heart veins in counter-time, each against other, the light barely resisting the waves of dark. There are other choices, Rand said. The wheel weaves the pattern, not you. Every trap you've laid for me, I have escaped. I've escaped your Fades and Trollocs, escaped your dark friends. I tracked you here and destroyed your army on the way. You do not weave the pattern. Baalzaman's eyes rolled.
Those who had anything at all beyond the rags on their backs. In truth, they crowded the fat vessels so that Nynaeve began to wonder whether Neras had been right about that, too. Yet such hope dawned on their faces
Hey,
once
Migs, how
their
you
feet were
doing?
firmly on the deck, that she was embarrassed to have considered it. And when they learned she had paid their passage, they clustered around her, struggling to kiss her hands, the hem of her skirt, crying out thanks and blessings, some with tears streaming down dirty cheeks, men as well as women. She wished she could sink through the planks under her feet. The decks bustled as sweeps went out and sails rose, and Samara began to dwindle behind before she could put an end to the demonstration completely. If Elaine or Birgitte had said one word, she would have thumped them both twice around the ship for good measure. 5 days they were on River Serpent. 5 days running down the slowly winding Eldar through baking days and nights not much cooler. Some things changed for the better in that time, but the voyage did not begin well. The first real problem of the trip was Neras' cabin in the stern, the only accommodation on the ship except the deck. Not that Neras was reluctant about moving out. His haste, breeches and coats and shirts flung over his shoulders and dangling from a great wad in his arms, shaving mug clutched in one hand and razor in the other, made Nynaeve look hard at Tom and Julian and Uno. It was one thing for her to make use of them when she chose to, quite another for them to go looking after her behind her back. Their faces could not have been more open, or their eyes more innocent. Elaine brought up another of Linny's sayings. An open sack hides nothing, and an open door hides little, but an open man is surely hiding something. But whatever problem the men might prove to be, the problem now was the cabin itself. It smelled of must and mold, even with the tiny windows swung out, and they let little light into its dank confines. Confines was the word. The cabin was small, smaller than the wagon, and most of the space was taken by a heavy table and high-backed chair fastened to the floor, and the ladder leading up to the deck. A washstand built into the wall with a grimy pitcher and bowl and a narrow dusty mirror crowded the room still more, and completed the furnishings, except for a few empty shelves and pegs for hanging clothes. The ceiling beams crouched right overhead, even for them, and there was only one bed, wider than what they had been sleeping on, yet hardly wide enough for two. Tall as he was, Neras might as well have lived in a box. The man surely had not given up 1 inch that might be stuffed with carpet. Sarah in the night, Elaine, unburdening herself of her bundling hands on hips as she looked around encouragingly. And he wanted to leave in the night. I heard him tell one of his men that he meant to sail on through the wenches wanted. Not much pleased to be moving in daylight. Thinking of the other woman's elbows and cold feet, Nynaeve wondered whether she would not have done better with the refugees. What are you going on about? The man is a smuggler, Nynaeve. In this vessel? Dropping her own bundles, Nynaeve laid the scrip on the table and sat down on the bed. No, she would not sleep on deck. The cabin might smell, but it could be aired out, and if the bed was cramped... The ship did roll disturbingly. She might as well have what comfort she could. Elaine could not chase her out of there. It is a barrel. We will be lucky to reach Boan in 2 weeks. Night alone knows how long to Salidar. Neither of them really knew how far Salidar was, and it was not yet time to broach the matter with Captain Neras. Fits, even the name. River Serpent. What honest trader would name his craft so? Well, what if he is? It was the first time use of a smuggler. Elaine threw up her hands in exasperation. She did think obeying the law was important, however fool the law was. She shared more with Galad than she would be willing to admit. So Neras had called them
Hey,
wenches.
OG, hey, Noda, how you doing?
The second difficulty was room
Hey,
for the
Fishing
others.
Studios.
River Serpent was not a very large vessel.
Sorry, I'm behind in all the
And
chat.
counting
I was
everyone,
trying
there
to
were
figure
well
this
over
stuff
100
out.
people aboard. Base had to go to the crew working the sweeps and tending ropes and sails.
I hope all
and that
y'all are
did not
doing
leave
good this
much for
evening.
the passengers. It did not help that the refugees kept as far from the Shinarans as possible. It seemed they had had their fill of armed men. There was scarcely room for everyone to sit, and none for lying down.
How's everyone doing today?
Nynaeve approached Neras way. These room,
My Halloween
especially the
shirt.
women and children. You have no more cabin. You'll have to do. Straight ahead, pace to her left, he growled, "My hold is full of valuable cargo. Very valuable cargo." "I wonder if customs men are active along the Eldar here," Elaine said idly, eyeing the tree-lined banks to either side. The river was only a few hundred paces wide here, bordered with dried black mud and bare yellow clay. Gildan to one side and Amadicia to the other. It might seem odd to hold goods from the south, and you heading south. Oh, you probably have all the documents showing where you've paid duties. That you didn't understand because of the troubles in Samara. I have heard that excise men are quite understanding, really. The corners of down, he still did not look at either of them, which was why he had a very good view when Tom Fan's empty hands made a flourish and was suddenly twirling a pair of knives through his fingers before making one of them disappear. "Just keeping in practice," Tom said, scratching one long mustache with the other blade. "I like to maintain certain skills." The haired scalp and the fresh blood on his face, added to a blood-stained rent in one shoulder of his coat, and the hairs elsewhere besides, made him look villainous in any company but Uno's. The Shinaran's toothy smile held no mirth at all, and did unfortunate things to his long scar and the new slash down his face, red and raw. The glaring crimson eye on his patch almost paled in comparison. Neras shut his eyes and drew a long, long breath. The hatches came open, and crates and casks went splashing over the side, some heavy, most light and smelling of spices. Neras winced every time the river closed over something else. He brightened, if such a thing could be said of him, when Nynaeve directed the boats of silk and carpets and bales of fine linen be left below, until he realized it meant them for bedding. If his face had been sour before, now it could have curdled milk in the next room. When women began drawing out buckets of water and ropes to wash their children right there on the deck, he strode to the stern, hands clenched behind his back, and stared at the few floating casks as they fell behind. In a way, it was Neras's peculiar attitude toward women that began smoothing the edges from Elaine's acid tongue and Birgitta's. That was the way Nynaeve saw it. She herself had maintained her usual even disposition, of course. Neras disliked her. The crew spoke quickly when they had to speak to one of the women. Women used to demand money, they fought like alley cats, and they caused trouble. Any and all trouble a man had could be laid to women, one way or another. Neras expected half of them to be rolling on the deck, clawing one another before the first sunset. They would all flirt with his crew and bring on dissension where they did not cause fights. Could he have sent all women off his ship forever, he might have been happy. Could he have had them out of his life, he would have been ecstatic. Nynaeve had never encountered the like. Oh, she had heard men mutter about women and money as if men did not fling coin about like water. They just had no head for money, less than Elaine. And she'd even heard them lay various troubles to women, usually when it was they themselves who had caused all the bother. But she could not recall ever meeting a man who truly disliked women. It was a surprise to learn that Neres had a wife and a horde of children in Ebu Dar, but no surprise that he stayed at home only long enough to load a new cargo. He did not even want to talk to a woman. It was simply amazing. Sometimes Nynaeve found herself looking at him sideways, the way she would have at some incredible animal, far stranger than Sredit, or anything else in Luca's menagerie. Naturally, there was no way that Elaine or Birgitte could vent their bile where he might hear. Rolling eyes and meaningful Mom and the others' ridiculous expectations met. He surely would have seen it so.
Oh, damn.
That would have been unbearable. He left them no choice but to swallow their acid and smile. For herself, Nynaeve could have done with a little time with Tom and Uno and Juilin away from Nera's eye. They were forgetting themselves again, forgetting they were supposed to do as they were told. The results did not matter. They should wait. And for some reason, they had taken to tormenting Neres with darkly smiling comments about cracking heads and slitting throats. But the only place they could be sure of avoiding Neres was in the cabin. They were not particularly large men, though Tom was tall and Uno fairly wide, yet crowded in there, they would have filled the tiny space to where they were looming over her. Hardly conducive to the tongue lashing she wanted to hand out. Give a man the chance to loom, and he had the battle half won. So she put on a
How's
pleasant
everyone's
mask,
day been so
ignored
far?
startled frowns
Or
from
how
Tom and
was everyone's
Juilin,
day, should I say?
incredulous stares from Uno and Regan, and enjoyed the outward good temper the other women had been forced to adopt. She managed to keep smiling when she learned why the sails were so full, the undulating riverbanks rushing by under the afternoon as fast as a trotting horse. Neres had had the sweeps pulled in and stored along the railings. He looked almost happy. Almost. A low clay bluff ran along the Amadisia River. On the Gildan side lay a broad ribbon of reeds between river and trees, mainly. Samara lay only a few hours upriver. "You channeled," she said to Elaine through her teeth. Wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, she resisted the urge to dash it to the slowly heaving deck. The other passengers left a clear space for the two of them, and Birgitte a few paces across, but she still kept her voice low, and as affable as she could manage. Her stomach seemed to move a heartbeat behind the ship's roll. That hardly improved her temper. "This wind is your doing." She hoped there was enough red fennel in her scrip. From Elaine's damply glowing countenance and wide eyes, milk and honey should have fountained from her mouth. "You are turning into a frightened rabbit. Pull yourself together. Samara is miles behind us. No one could sense anything useful from that far. She would have to be on the ship with us to know. I was very quick." Nynaeve thought her own face might crack if she held her smile any longer, but out of the corner of her eye she could see Neres, studying his passengers and shaking his head. Angry as she was at that moment, she could also see the almost faded residue of the other woman's weaving. Working weather was like rolling a stone downhill. It tended to keep going the way you started it. When it bounced away from the path, as it would sooner or later, you just had to twitch it back. Mogadine might have felt a weave of that size from Samara, maybe, but certainly not well enough to say where it had been done. She herself was a match for Mogadine in raw strength, and if she was not strong enough to do something, it seemed safe to say the Forsaken was not either. And she did want to travel as quickly as possible. Right then, one day more than necessary in close quarters with the other two held as much attraction for her as sharing the cabin with Neres. For that matter, an extra day on the water was nothing to look forward to. How could a ship move in such a fashion when the river looked so flat? Smiling was beginning to make her lips ache. "You should have asked, Elaine. You always go and do things without asking, without thinking. It's time you realized if you fall into a hole running blindly, or old Nurse isn't going to come pick you up and wash your face." By the last word, Elaine's eyes were as round as teacups, and her bared teeth looked ready to bite. Birgitte put a hand on each of them, leaning close and beaming as though joy had her by the throat. If you two don't stop this, I'm going to tip you both into the river to cool off. You are both acting like Shago barmaids with winter itch. Sweating faces frozen in amiability, the three women stalked in different
not going
directions,
too bad. Can't
just
complain,
as far
man.
apart as the ship would allow. Near sunset, Nynaeve heard Rhaegon say that she and the others must really be relieved to be
Smoky.
away from Samara, the way they were all but laughing on one another's shoulder.
About it.
And the other men seemed to be thinking much the same. But the rest of the women
Smoking
aboard
do my,
watched them with
diamond
faces
art.
much too smooth. They knew trouble when they saw it. Yet, bit by bit, that trouble oozed away. Nynaeve was not exactly sure how. Perhaps the pleasant exteriors Elaine and Brigitta put on just seeped inside in spite of them.
Are you still here,
Perhaps the
Noda?
ridiculousness of it all, trying to keep a friendly smile on your face while putting a proper bite to the words, struck them more and more. Whatever did it, she did not come out. Slowly, day by day, words and tones began to match faces, and now and then one of them even looked embarrassed, plainly remembering how she had been behaving. Spoke one word of apology, which Nynaeve quite understood. Had she been as foolish and vicious as they, she certainly would not want to remind anyone. The children played a part in restoring and Brigitta to equilibrium, though it actually started with Nynaeve looking after the men's wounds that first. She kept full of herbs, making juices and ointments, bandaging cuts. Those gashes made her angry enough to heal. Sickness and injury always made her angry, and she did so for some of the worst, though she was careful. Wounds vanishing, people talking, and the Light knew what Neras would do if he thought he had an Aes Sedai aboard. Very likely sneak a man ashore in Amadisia by night and try to have them arrested. For that matter, the news might have sent refugees over the side. With Uno, for example, she rubbed a touch of stinging mardroot oil liniment on his heavy bruised shoulder, dabbed a bit of heel oil ointment on the brush down his face, and wrapped his head in bandages so he could hold his jaw before healing him. When he gasped and fled, said, "No, baby. Thought a little pain would be big, strong. Who's alone? If you haven't touched them in the next 3 days, I'll dose you with something you won't soon forget." He nodded slowly, staring at her so uncertainly that it was plain he did not know what she had done. Eli finally took the bandages off. With luck, no one else would remember exactly how bad the gash had been, and he should have sense enough to keep his mouth shut. Once she began, it was only natural to go on to the... Few of the refugees had bruises and scrapes, and some of the children were showing signs of fevers or worms. Those she could heal without worry. Children always made a fuss when they were... If they...
Sorry I missed that part of the chat,
She'd
bro.
never really been comfortable around children. True, she wanted to have Lan's babies. Part of her did. Children could make a mess from nothing. They seemed to have the habit of doing the opposite of what you told them as soon as your back was turned, just to see how you would react. Yet she found herself smoothing back the dark hair of a no higher than her waist, who stared with bright blue eyes. They looked very like Lan's eyes. Elaine and Brigitta joined her just to help her at first, but one way or another they gravitated to the children too. Did not look at all silly with or four cradled.
Salut Chris,
Cradled on either hip, and a ring of children about her, singing them a nonsense song about dancing out. Elaine held a sack of candy. The Light knew where she had gotten it. She did not look guilty. She did not look guilty at all when Nynaeve caught her sneaking one into her mouth. She only grinned, heaped of temper in those circumstances. She bracelet and leash created a strange form of linking. Nynaeve even sat with her once or twice, the sight of the vile thing itself to enable her to embrace Saidar and follow along. The refugee stories came out of course. Separated, lost, dead. Farms and shops and crafts spread out. Trade. People could not buy when they could not sell. The Prophet had only been the last brick on the cart that broke the axle. Nynaeve said nothing when she saw Elaine slipping a gold mark to a fellow with thin gray hair who knuckled a wrinkled forehead and tried to kiss her hand. She would learn how fast gold vanished. Besides, Nynaeve had handed out a few coins herself. Well, perhaps more than a few. All but 2 of the men were grizzled or balding, with leathery faces and calloused hands. Younger men had been snatched into the army if they were not caught up by the Prophet. Those who refused one or the other had been hanged. The young pair, little more than boys, really. Nynaeve doubted if either had to shave regularly, wore hunted stares, and flinched if one of the Shienarans looked at them. Sometimes the older men talked of starting over, finding a bit of land to farm or taking up their trade again, but the tone of their voices said it was more bluff and bravado than real hope. Mostly they talked quietly of their families, a wife lost, sons and daughters lost, grandchildren lost. They sounded lost. The second night, a jug-eared fellow who had seemed the most enthusiastic in a sad lot had just vanished. He was simply gone when the sun came up. He might have swum ashore. Nynaeve hoped he had. Still, it was the women who caught her heart. They had no more prospects than the men, no more certainties, but most had more burdens. None had a husband with her, or even knew if she had a husband alive. Yet the responsibility that weighed them down also kept them moving. No woman with grit could give up when she had children. Even the others meant to find some future, though. They all had at least a scrap of the hope the men only pretended to. 3 especially tugged at her. Nicola was about her age and height, a slender dark-haired weaver with big eyes who had been intending to marry. Until her Hiron took it into his head that duty called him to follow the Prophet, to follow the Dragon Reborn. He would marry her when his duty was seen to. Duty had been very important to Hiron. He would have made a good and conscientious husband and father, so Nicola said. Only, whatever was in his head had not done him much good when someone split it with an axe. Nicola did not know who or why, just that she had to get as far from the Prophet as she could. Somewhere, there had to be a place where there was no killing, where she would not always be in fear of what might be around the next corner. Marigan, a few years older, had been plump once, but her frayed brown dress hung on her loosely now, and her blunt face looked beyond weary. Her 2 sons, 6 and 7, stared silently at the world with 2 big eyes. Clinging to each other, they seemed frightened of everything and everyone else, even their own mother. Marigan had dealt in cures and herbs in Samara, though she had some odd ideas about both. That was no wonder, really. A woman who offered healing with Amadisia and White Cloaks right across the river had to keep low, and even from the first, she had had to teach herself. All she had ever wanted to do was cure sickness, and she claimed to have done it well, though she had not been able to save her husband. The 5 years since his death had been hard, and the coming of the Prophet had certainly not helped her any. Mobs searching for Aes Sedai chased her into hiding after she had cured a man of fever, and rumor had turned it into bringing him back from the dead. That was how little most people knew of Aes Sedai. Death was beyond the power to heal. Even Marigan seemed to think it was not. She did not know where she was going any more than Nicola. A village somewhere, she hoped, where she could dispense herbs again in peace. Arena was the youngest of the 3, with steady blue eyes and a face bruised purple and yellow, and not from Gildan at all. Her clothes would have said that if nothing else did. A short dark coat and voluminous trousers not much different from Brigitta's. They were the sum of her possessions. She would not say where she was from exactly, but she was forthcoming about the road that had led her to River Serpent, about some of it. Nynaeve had to infer in places. Arena had gone to Ilion, meaning to bring her younger brother home before he could take the oath as a hunter for the Horn. With thousands in the city, however, she had never found him, but somehow she had found herself taking the oath, setting out to see the world while not quite believing the Horn of Valier existed. half hoping that somewhere she would find young Gwyll and take him home. Things had been difficult since. Arena was not precisely reluctant to talk, but she made such an effort to put a good face on things. She'd been chased out of several villages, robbed once, and beaten several times. Even so, she had no intention of giving up or seeking sanctuary or a peaceful village. The world was still out there, and Arena meant to wrestle it to the ground. Not that she put it that way, but Nynaeve knew it was what the woman meant. Nynaeve knew very well why they touched her most, too. Each story could have been the reflection of a thread in her own life. What she did not quite understand was why she liked Arena best. Putting this together, it may be coincidence that she was harried out of one village so quickly she had to leave her horse behind, calling the mayor loon. Some village women that drove section sweepers had no question why she was on the road alone. It was what she admitted to saying. Nynaeve thought a few days of herself, for example, would do Arena worlds of good. And there had to be something she could do for the other two as well. She could understand a desire for safety and peace very well. There was an odd exchange of the second day, while tempers were still tender and tongues, some people, still rough. Nynaeve said something quite mildly. Not being in her mother's palace, she need not think Nynaeve shoved against the wall that night. Elaine her chin, but before she could open her mouth, blurted, "You are the daughter of Mordor?" She hardly looked around to make sure no one was close enough to hear. "I am." Elaine sounded more dignified than Nynaeve remembered in some time, but there was a hint of satisfaction. Face Birgitte simply away, walking now where she sat in a coil of soup, still a shiver ahead. Elaine frowned after her, then sit beside her. They sat talking softly for some time. Nynaeve would not have joined them, even had she been asked. Elaine seemed slightly disgruntled, as if she had expected some other reason, but after that there was hardly a cross word between them. Birgitte resumed her own name later that same day, though it was a last flare of temper that did it. With Mokadeen safely behind them, she and Elaine the black out of their hair with poke leaf, and Nera's seeing with red gold curls about ears in an intricate braid, and that one with bow and quiver, muttered acridly about Birgitte stepping out of the bloody store. It was his misfortune that she overheard. That was her name, he told him sharply, and if he did not like it, pin his ears to either last he chose, blindfolded. He stalked off red-faced and shouting for lines to be tightened that could not have been made any tighter without popping. At that point, Nynaeve would not have heard whether Birgitte actually carried a threat. Poke might have left a slight reddish cast to her own hair, yet it was close enough to its natural color almost to make her cry for joy. Unless everyone aboard came down with sore gums and toothaches, more than enough poke leaf remaining, and sufficient red fennel to keep her stomach in its place. She could not help sighing in satisfaction. Her hair was dry and in a proper braid again. Of course, with Elaine channeling good winds and near light or dark, thatch-roofed villages and farms sped past on either bank, marked by people waving in the lit windows in the night, showing no sign of the turmoil. Broad as the misnamed, it rolled along downriver. Nera seemed torn and pleasant. Good luck at such winds and worry at moving in daylight. More than once he at a backwater, a tree-shrouded stream into the bank, where a serpent might have been more. Occasionally, Nynaeve remarked where he could hear about how glad he must be that the people from Samara would soon be off his ship, with a comment thrown about how well he was looking now that she was rested, or how energetic that woman's children were. That was enough to put ideas out of his head. It might have been easier to threaten him with the Shinarans, or Tom and Jewelin, but those fellows were getting entirely too big-headed as it was. And she certainly with a neither look at her nor to her. Gray dawning of the third day saw the crew manning the sweep again to draw their Boanda. It was a considerable town, larger than Samara, on a point of land where the swift river Bourne, coming down from Jahanna, ran into the slow Eldar. There were even 3 towers inside the walls, and a building shining white beneath a red tile roof that could certainly pass for a palace, if one. It was lashed fast to the pilings at the end of one, half their length across dried mud. Nynaeve wondered aloud why Neras had gone all the way to Samara when he could have unloaded. Elaine nodded toward a man on the dock who wore a chain with some sort of seal hanging across his chest. There were several others like him, all with the chain, intent on watching 2 other vessels unloaded at other docks. Queen Aleandra's excise men, I should say. Drumming his fingers on the rail, Neras was not looking at them just as intently as they were at the other vessels. Perhaps he had an arrangement with those in Samara. I don't think he wants to talk. The men and women from marched reluctantly up the gangplank, ignored by the excise men. There was no custom duty on people. For the Samarans it was the beginning of uncertainty. They had their lives ahead of them, and knew what they stood up in. Nynaeve and Elaine and them. Before they were halfway down the dock, still huddling together, some of the women were beginning to look as disheartened as the men. Some even began to cry. Vexation painted Elaine's face. She always wanted to take care of everyone. Nynaeve hoped Elaine did not discover that she had slipped silvers to some of the women. Not all left the ship. And Nicola and Marigan, tightly clutching her sons, who gazed in anxious silence after the other children vanishing toward the town. The 2 last words since Samara that Nynaeve had heard. "I want to go with you," Nynaeve, unconsciously wringing her hands. "I feel safe near you." Marigan nodded emphatically. Arena said nothing, but she stepped closer to the other 2 women, making herself part of the group, even as she looked levelly at Nynaeve, defying her to send her away. Tom shook his head slightly, and Jewelin grimaced, but it was to Elaine and Brigitte that Nynaeve looked. Elaine did not hesitate in nodding, and the other woman was only a second behind. Gathering her skirts, Nynaeve marched to Neras standing in the stern. "I suppose I will have my ship back now," he told the air somewhere between. "Not before. This has been the worst I ever took." Eve smiled broadly. Look at her before she was done. They almost did. It was not as if Neras had much choice. He could hardly appeal to the authorities in Boanda, and if he did not like the fares she offered, well, he had to sail downriver anyway. So the river serpent cast off again, heading for Ebou Dar, with one stop to be made that he was not informed of until Boanda began falling astern. He growled, staring over Nynaeve's head. "Salidar's been abandoned since the White Cloak War. It would take a fool woman to want to be ashore at Salidar." Even smiling, Nynaeve was angry enough to embrace the source. Neras roared, staring at his neck and hip at the same time. "The horseflies are very bad this time of year," she said sympathetically. Brigitte roared with laughter before they were halfway down the deck. Standing in the bows, Nynaeve inhaled deeply as a channeled to bring the wind up, and river serpents lumbered into the strong current flowing out of the horn. She was all but eating red fennel fields, but even if she would not care. Their journey was almost over. Everything she had been through was worth it for that. Of course, she had not always thought so, and Elaine and Brigitte's gasping tongues had not been the only. That first night, lying on the captain's bed in her shift, while a yawning Elaine occupied the chair and Brigitte leaned against the door with her head brushing the beams, Nynaeve had used the twisted stone ring. A single rusty gimbal-mounted lamp gave light, and surprisingly a scent of spice from the oil. Maybe Neras had not liked the stench of must and mold either. If she was ostentatious about nestling the ring between her breasts and making sure the others knew it touched skin, well, she had cause. A few hours of superficially reasonable behavior on their parts had not made her less wary. The heart of the stone was exactly as it had been every time before. Everywhere and nowhere, the glittering crystal sword Kalendor thrust into the floor stones beneath the great polished red stone columns running off into shadow. And that sensation that was Tel'aran'rhiod, it was all Nynaeve could do to flee off on a frantic search of the columns. She forced herself to beside Kalendor, counting slowly to 1,000 and pausing every 100 to call Egwene's name. Truly, it was all she could do. The control she was so proud of vanished. Her clothes flickered with her worries about herself and Mogadine, Egwene and Rand and between one next stout cloak and hood, which became a cloak mail, which became the red silk dress, only which became an ever thicker cloak, which became... thought her face changed too. Once she saw hands, with skin darker than jewels, as if Mogadine recognized her. The last horse the columns. Nynaeve made herself stand there shivering for one more count of 100. The great chamber remained empty except for her. Wishing she could feel more regret than haste, she stepped out of the dream, and lay fingering the stone ring on its thong, staring at the thick beams above the bed, and listening to the 1,000 creaks of the ship, rushing downriver through the darkness. "Was she there?" Elaine demanded. "You were not gone very long, but..." "I am tired of being afraid," Nynaeve, her gaze from the beams. "I am so being a coward." The last words dissolved into tears she could neither stop nor hide, no matter how she scrubbed at her eyes. Elaine was there in an instant, hair, and an instant later, Birgitte pressed a cloth dampened and cool